Welcome to Season 3 of Candid Leadership. Throughout this season, I'm taking recommendations from listeners to speak with leaders and mentors of inspiration. Today's guest was recommended by listeners from Georgetown. Rebecca Patterson is our guest today. She's the Associate Director for the Center of Security Studies and Security Studies program at Georgetown University, where she educates a new generation of analysts, policymakers, and scholars about the range of international and national security problems and foreign policy issues of the 21st century. Her courses teach graduate-level courses on strategy, policy, and military operations. She earned a PhD from George Washington University in national security policy, and previously she taught at the United States Military Academy at West Point, the National Defense University, and the George Washington University. She has also worked as a strategic advisor with NATO in Afghanistan and worked as an economist at the World Bank. A veteran and graduate of West Point, Rebecca has an absolute wealth of experience in national security and strategy. Welcome to Candid Leadership, Rebecca. It's great to have you join us.
Thank you so much, Candace. It's wonderful to be here with you today.
So let's start off where you're at now. And full disclosure to listeners, I have the distinct pleasure to work with Rebecca at Georgetown as we discuss about the Security Studies program. Let's see kind of where it fits into national security. Take it from here, Rebecca.
Thanks. So our program's mission is to teach a new generation of analysts, policymakers, and scholars to think critically and act responsibly in the face of the 21st century's most pressing national and international security problems. So I think about the program in terms of three parts. First is the coursework and curriculum. That's basically what we're teaching the students. The second is the people themselves, so the faculty, staff, and students who really make it the best security studies program in the world. And then finally, the culture, which I think is a function of the classes, the people, and also the events and co-curricular activities that go beyond the classroom.
That is awesome. And I think what's really important is you kind of spoke to the culture. So let's talk about that. Let's dive into why a culture of any program you run, and this applies to listeners, it applies to where you work, the culture of the environment, whether it's a unit, organization, business. But how did you create that culture and how do you continue it?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, culture is something that needs to be continually built. And it's always front of mind in considering how well we're doing and how well we're meeting the needs of our students. So on the coursework and curriculum side of things, I really believe that grad school is an opportunity for students to find their voice, to help them identify their biases, hone their skills, whether it be analytical or writing, learn new ones, right? It's a chance to try something on to see if you like it or even to fail. Things like negotiation or red teaming, research methods, Python, which sounds scary to me, statistics, lots of really opportunities to push students beyond their comfort zone. The people, though, are also important, right? So the exchange of ideas that happens in the classroom and pre-COVID, the halls of higher education institutions is really a key component of education. So understanding those who think differently, hold different beliefs, ascribe to alternative views of the world makes the national security community a better, more thoughtful place. And these differences, among many others, is vital to greater understanding of the problems the US and the world faces, as well as coming up with innovative solutions to increasingly more complex problems. And as you said, I think culture is what makes one graduate degree program from another. And ours really aims to be inclusive in every way. So events that go beyond the curriculum is a key component of building that culture, but it also requires time and attention on the part of each component of the community: students, faculty, alumni, and staff. So part of what makes us unique, maybe not unique in DC, but certainly unique in terms of the rest of the world, is not only are our students going out into the national security space, our faculty come from the organizations our students aspire to work. So often the faculty will come in and out of our institution because they're going in and out of government. So one of my full-time faculty colleagues, Ben Buchanan, is currently serving in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. The current Secretary of the Army, Christine Wormuth, is a former adjunct. Travis Atkins, currently at USAID. Chidi Blyden in the Pentagon, John Cohen at DHS, Frank Rose at the National Nuclear Security Administration, just to name a few of the over 200 adjuncts we have, people like yourself. And this happens in every administration. Faculty leave and come back. These experiences are invaluable to enriching both the curricular aspect, but connecting them to the policy world. Professionals are always learning new things, relying on their coworkers and their network to contribute to solving national security problems, and are members of the national security ecosystem. While our faculty are teaching students, we are all still learning from them ourselves. A significant number of our students are working in those same organizations, and they help sharpen our own thinking.
I find that interesting in the fact that you almost learn just as much from the students than you do from the instructor. And sometimes I wonder to myself, do the students understand how that feedback loop works? Because it is so enriching. I know that we've spoken in the past about kind of the important for both the diversification of the faculty and then the curriculum that you teach. Can you talk to that?
I think about our students coming from very different perspectives and having had different work and life experiences. So I guess first I want to tackle the sort of military side of things, because we do have a pretty substantial percentage of our students that have either served in the military or are going, en route to teach at West Point, or they're Air Force students or Naval Academy students sort of getting their graduate degree right away. And it sort of takes me back to my own experience in visiting Normandy. I'll never forget this. My father and I went there and we were having this amazing tour. And we found out that World War II veterans are often frequent tour takers there. And I thought to myself, like, why would you want to do that? But the tour guide, who, this French woman who obviously had no military experience herself, said that they didn't know the whole picture. They didn't understand what they were really a part of when they were, storming the beach or, running through the hedgerows. So they really didn't understand the broader economic, historical, and political significance of their actions. So they had to learn that from a tour guide decades later, hopefully preventing the requirement to actually go on a tour of your battlefield, but thinking about how do we give students the space to really understand what they went through and to connect it to something broader. And at the same time, I think the civilian students, the really small percentage of people who serve in the military. So I think building those relationships between the military students and their civilian counterparts is really instrumental in greater understanding, but also better civil-military relations down the line. One place that I think is really vital to accessing alternative views is in the readings and the case studies we assign. So in my own education, I typically only learned the US perspective on a particular war. But wars have at least two sides. So as we increasingly gain access to new information about our adversaries, incorporating their views, intent, and strategy of the other side is a key component of understanding our past and learning with an eye towards the future. So I think the Vietnam War is a great example. So reading what the Viet Cong thought and the strategy of Ho Chi Minh illuminates how the US got it wrong, which holds some important lessons for how we think about strategy today. So a while ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Vietnam as a tourist and was able to witness the impact of the war I had studied firsthand. We visited many of the sites that were made famous by movies and books, to include the Cu Chi Tunnels, which is now a tourist site, and a museum that was dedicated to memorializing the War of American Aggression. Quite a different naming convention than our own. In the museum, there were several movies that featured various aspects of the war from the North Vietnamese viewpoint. And in fact, one of their war heroes was a woman who was celebrated for her actions, many of which resulted in the death of American soldiers. The movies were hard to watch, but I found it noteworthy that the Vietnam culture revered women and their contributions to the war effort and combat in particular. This seems to me a very different narrative than our own, which rarely considers women as warriors and certainly not war heroes.
And that's fascinating, that going to a different country, looking at war from a different angle, and then also seeing who they kind of hold up. I know even between, World War I and World War II, a big component that was almost morale crushing was the destruction of actual statues between the wars and how that had a psychological impact on the German psyche. I think there are several things that, when you see war from a different perspective, you understand how it got to that point and how their view of the world shapes the decisions that are made by policymakers. Rebecca, you just spoke about your experience traveling to Vietnam and how we talk about war now, especially whether it's within the Pentagon or within the executive or just simply in media or across America. How we talk about war is sometimes based on what we read, the strategy, what we see now. In the book that I continued to promote and remind exceptionally brilliant people to continue to go back and read again is The Art of War is a great example. I admit I'm a little biased because that's one of those that I think intelligence officers or anyone in the intelligence profession should review and reread, especially now that we've had this focus and a pivot on where we're looking. Who do you see as one of those pivotal authors that you remind people, hey, you should relook at this, and maybe it will reflect on how you talk about or think about war?
Yeah, I also think The Art of War is an amazing way to think about war, in part because its lessons really transcend the way that Americans typically think about war, is either you're using force or you're not using force. And I think increasingly in today's society in particular, the Chinese and Russian strategic thought is so different from ours because they don't see things in nearly as black and white, and that they're always trying to rewrite the board, not that they have to just move the pieces on it. So I also really enjoy the writings of Kautilya, who we typically assign to the same week as we talk about The Art of War, who was an Indian strategic thinker, perhaps the world's first realist. Before we ever had Mearsheimer, there was Kautilya. And so part of that is really thinking about how do we ally ourselves with other countries to maximize our own security, and sort of thinking about how borders and neighbors, how do we think about them in terms of creating security around our own country? But I do think, going back to your example of The Art of War, anything that sort of pushes on our own assumptions about the way the world works, I think is really important.
You spoke a little bit about The Art of War, and that is awesome. I do want to shout out to listeners, Kautilya, the quote that I now attribute nonstop to him: "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." And that's one that isn't in a lot of our doctrine, a lot of the things that we read in the military, but one that is in a substantive amount of, especially the Army and the way we view things, is Huntington's Soldier in the State. And I found it incredibly insightful. I have reread this portions of the text or the book itself on 3 or 4 different occasions across my multiple decade career here. And to hear the perspective from students now was incredibly insightful in the things that they picked up on and the cultural changes that have occurred. The book was written right after World War II, where so many people had an understanding of what service meant and had served, and the apolitical nature of it, vice kind of the coupling of politics into almost everything now. It's so difficult, and so many students really kind of pushed back against it. As a recipient of someone who has read and studied and, been told over and over again about the dominance of Huntington's writing, I think things are really changing. I think we have experienced something within not only our culture at large in America, but within the culture of the military, that those lines that were once thought to have been very stark and deep and thick are starting to blur a little bit more. How do you see this?
I, like you, was really brought up thinking that the Huntington's view of civil-military relations was really the way it should be. Part of it, I think, grew out of this interest in what did it mean to be profession at the time of his writing. And that was something that was sort of considered as separate, or like a calling to something. And in some ways, I think that's not a bad way to describe the military itself as a profession with its own sorts of criteria and characteristics. But I think what has been really unhelpful for the military and its input into the national security policymaking process is this idea that there are 2 spheres of knowledge, right? Or 2 spheres of action. There's the sort of political and the policy side, and then there's the military side. And, never the 2 shall meet. And so, the policymakers should do their thing and tell them what they want the military to do, and then the military should be left alone to sort of figure it out. And, for those of us who've read Clausewitz, that there is no separation really between the military and policy, right? Like, war is just politics by other means. And so it sounds lovely. And who wouldn't want there to be these completely different spheres in which we can just divvy up the work and there's no conflict and there's no concern and everybody understands everything. And if you've spent any time in this world, that that's not at all accurate and that's not the way the world works. And I think, we often talk about the strategic corporal, right? Like the amount of knowledge and wherewithal and even now probably emotional intelligence that's required even at the lowest levels because anything that happens can have strategic impacts. And so I think more now so than ever before, I think we need to acknowledge the political nature of so many things that the military does. And I don't say that to mean that it's partisan, that we're choosing one party over another in our actions, but just that most of the actions of the military inherently have political consequences. And so I think the Obama's wars and talking through them, or crystal firing, I mean, you can really see how these readings and so how we ascribe and what we believe about civil relations and how embedded that is, those thoughts are in the military itself, can really have strategic consequences for the entire war, right? Like that relationship between the commander in chief and his most senior generals being really pivotal to the outcomes of any of the conflicts that we find ourselves in. So I think Huntington is a great place to start when it comes to civil military relations. And I think there's value in reading it and understanding it. But I definitely don't think that's what we, the military anyway, should take away as what they should aspire to do is has really have this like separate sphere at which it should be completely divorced from the political.
Exactly, because there's such a difference between nonpartisan and apolitical. And I think that difference, it's incredibly important. So we're going to pivot now again and talk about mentoring, because that, to me, is the purpose behind this podcast in the end. So you and I were both members of the Margaret Corbin Forum at West Point. And this group was aimed at educating, empowering, and inspiring leaders of character, really through the facilitation of gender-specific issues within the Corps of Cadets, broadly looking at the Army, and then, of course, the society at large. It provided opportunities for education, mentoring, and networking to support cadets who were in school. When we participated, we spoke often to mentors who spoke about the impacts of marriage and parenthood on service to the nation, of course, when we left West Point. And most recently, you and I spoke about the spectrum of really what a family looks like in the profession. I'd love to kind of hear your view of your own story of parenthood and how you see the changes and things that you've gone through as a mentor.
Absolutely. So first of all, I want to take us back, you and I back, more than 20 years ago, to those moments when we were really interested in these topics as college juniors or seniors, for those of you who weren't West Pointers. And, in hindsight, after just thinking about this week, it's interesting that it took an organization that was really meant to, as you said, have a forum for women to talk about the things that were specific issues for them. But that's the organization that put on this sort of panel about marriage or relationships in the military. And at the time, the relationships in the military part impacted both genders, right? It was not just a woman issue. Most people find a spouse or a partner of some kind at some point in their career. It's not just women who are getting married. And of course, we would have both women and men who attended, but I think that speaks to who we feel comfortable talking about relationships with. But getting back to my own story of marriage/parenthood, I want to bring it back a little bit to those foundational ideals of Georgetown. And as a Jesuit education, we talk about cura personalis, or care of the whole person. And I think that's really not dramatically different from the way we think about taking care of soldiers in the military. But when I think about what makes a person successful in their life, a huge part of that is their family, in particular, their partner or their spouse. So the right partner can be encouraging, supportive, and uplifting. But on the other hand, the wrong partner can impede both your personal and professional goals, prevent you from thriving, and destroy your confidence. You really have to start from a place of mutual respect and hopefully admiration. So anytime a career opportunity has presented itself, my husband has encouraged me to go for it, knowing I always have his support has made all the difference to me in my career choices. So my husband and I had been married about 5 years before we had our first child, a daughter. So during those first years of marriage, we lived together for only about half of that time, which is not uncommon for military couples. We really joked about how that forced us to find ways to really enjoy the time we were able to spend together. But that intermittent separation really forced us to figure out how to communicate effectively. We put in a lot of work to build a solid relationship. And when our daughter was born, it became apparent very quickly that she had significant medical issues, which we would come to find out much later that she had an extremely rare medical condition. So in her first 2 years of life, we had several medevacs and more than 150 doctor appointments. So during that period, we were devastated, scared, and frantically looking for answers. The only solid ground we had to stand on was our faith in each other. So it quickly became obvious how marriages fail. If ours hadn't been solid, it would have been a very different outcome.
And I think that is incredibly important in the fact that the strength of the relationship that you have with someone can have such an incredible toll on so much of the trajectory of your life. And so because we had talked about this years ago, I found it important for listeners to understand that all of the things that we spoke about just up to this mentorship point were really driven by Rebecca's ability to not only have an incredibly supportive partner, but also to be able to have that partnership and undergo true challenges. And so we've spoken in the past really about in your 30s, those critical years. And, there are critical points in your 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. And as I'm dealing with teenagers right now, you also have those great criticality, who you're really becoming in those years. But in your 30s, there's a true confluence of just so many things with your time, your space, your energy, and having the right partner, the person that you're with who is supportive for you to continue to achieve that greatness that's destined, it really makes all the difference. And I think going back to the Margaret Corbin Forum and the questions that were posed there, I reflected on that with you this week. I think there are truly aspects of your life that you can look at and say, even if you make decisions, you can walk back from some of those decisions if the decisions aren't great. But that partner that you find that is supportive and that understands, especially those of us serving in the national security space, if they are there with you along for this wild ride, it makes all the difference. And I can say I am just very excited to be on this ride with you now too, Rebecca. It's been quite a fun journey. Rebecca, I know we had also talked about some of the mentorship lessons you learned. Is there anything that you can attribute to people that were with us in the Margaret Corbin Forum?
Yeah, absolutely. One of our mentors at the time would just remind us that you can have it all, but not at the same time. And I think that's so important to remember that as you're navigating your career and your home life throughout your 30s, 40s, and 50s. So just being honest with yourself and your partner about what you need and what your expectations are and how they might support you, but thinking about how at different points in your life, you're sort of the main effort and maybe others, you're the supporting effort. But over time, really, who's doing what matters less than how you got through it together.
What a perfect way to end this episode, Rebecca. Thank you so much for being with us today on Candid Leadership. I really appreciate you listening to this conversation with Rebecca Patterson. If you want more candid perspectives on leadership, go to colonelcandid.com. I encourage you to sign up for the newsletter where you'll receive the latest Candid Leadership episode notifications, writing, and links to other great leadership and mentorship content. As we mentioned in the beginning, I'm always up for recommended guests. Season 3 is full of great leaders and mentors recommended by you, the listener. I would also encourage you to share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and whoever you think could benefit from the information and wisdom shared by my amazing guests. I know I grow with every conversation, and I want to share that experience with as many leaders as we can. This show grows by word of mouth, so be sure to share this podcast, and please, if you think I've earned it, leave Candid Leadership a 5-star review on wherever you find yourself listening to this podcast. All views are my own. Thanks again for joining me. I'm Colonel Candace Frost.